Good morning and welcome to this very important COVID-19 webinar that we're sponsoring here with Vallent Group. So glad to be with our friends and clients at Vallent Group. I'm Matt Stiles of Maynard, Cooper & Gale. Joining me is my colleague Matthew Canova. And this is an exciting time to be an employer. It's a troubling time to be an employer, and we know that you've got a lot of questions about how to handle the COVID-19 response, and we commend our colleagues with Vallent Group for putting together this webinar on such a quick basis to try and cover this topic today. And in the interest of trying to make this as practical and accessible for our participants as possible, I think you'll find that we're doing this a bit different than some of the webinars you might have seen or some of the online resources you might have found. I think the emphasis on some of the other materials out there has been too heavy on here's what the law says, good luck applying it. And granted, this is not easy stuff, so I can understand why that's a common approach to it. Our approach today is going to be first and foremost to walk you through the frequently asked questions that we are getting. Now, you've got a chat tab there with your webinar screen, and you're able to ask us questions, and when one of us is not talking, we'll be answering questions. But what I would ask you to do is perhaps hold questions related to COVID-19 responses until we have had a chance to work through all the FAQs that we've got, and we've got them organized by topic. And we're going to be as practical about what we would do and what we're recommending in response to these frequently asked questions as possible. When we get to the conclusion of that segment, I would say bombard us with any FAQs about COVID-19 response that you have that we didn't answer as part of the webinar topic, and that's just because I want to make sure everybody gets their questions answered today. The second half of the time that we have together, we're going to focus on an analysis of the current version of the House relief package on COVID-19. This is the Phase 2 relief bill that affects employers, and it has to do with an expansion of FMLA leave. It has to do with paid sick leave. And so we'll cover the current status of that bill in the second half. And I think what will work pretty well if we stick to that plan is that I'll be running my mouth about the relief bill, and my colleague Matthew Canova will be answering via the chat tab whatever questions we didn't cover verbally through the FAQ discussion. So that's kind of the housekeeping here. Now, of course, you've got the chat tab there, so feel free to use that when you're ready to do so. Also, upon the conclusion of today's webinar, we'll be providing a link to the recording, a copy of the slides to our colleagues at Vallent Group. They'll be sure to push those out to you if you have a need, if there is something that you need to get a handle on for your COVID-19 response and we were unable to address it today, please reach out to your Vallent Group consultant. With that, I want to get started on our material for this morning. First of all, first and foremost, this is an employment law minefield as far as how we respond to the COVID-19 outbreak. And when we think about the implications under the law, it sometimes requires us to think about what hat we are wearing when we make decisions, particularly if you are a self-funded employer out there with information related to your plan versus information that you receive from an employee. So we have implications for employment law decisions under the ADA, under the FMLA, under the Fair Labor Standards Act. We've got employee benefit plan administration issues under HIPAA, COBRA, complying with the Affordable Care Act itself. So it absolutely is one of these issues where I think an integrated and sort of holistic approach to how you want to devise a response strategy is necessary. Maynard, Cooper & Gale, here we have a COVID-19 task force where we've got our colleagues broken out by specialty group dealing with unique issues related to COVID-19. We've got individuals who specialize, for example, in the logistics implications of COVID-19, who specialize in contracts related to COVID-19, who specialize in insurance claims related to COVID-19. So to the extent that there's a COVID-19 issue that your business is facing, that is not within the realm of labor, employment, or benefits law, which Matthew and I will be discussing today, we encourage you to reach out to us, and we'll put you in touch with our colleague with the expertise in that particular subject matter area. Starting with the framework of all of these laws that potentially intersect here with our employer responses, I do hope that if there's any one takeaway that you have today, that takeaway is that the law in many respects provides us with a baseline, and I think that you will find that the baseline legal obligations we have under the law tend to be more favorable to employers right now than you might expect. In other words, you have more powers as an employer to have an aggressive response to this than perhaps you might want to assert right now. And I will try to illustrate some of those examples when we get into the FAQs. But what that means is that often the questions that we're getting are, Matthew, can we do X, Y, and Z? And I think that we have found over and over again that when we get that question, usually the law says yes, the employer can do whatever business strategy the employer has in mind. The law is pretty broad and employer friendly in these areas. But I think we then have to get into the next question, which is, well, then what should we do? And I think that's a hugely important question, and it's a question that doesn't just implicate the law, and in fact, it doesn't just implicate the health professional opinions that we're getting either from national health experts or from our own trusted healthcare providers. I think it also goes to the type of culture you want to build as an employer. What types of relationships do we want to have with our employees? It's as true for Matthew and me at a time like this as it is for your trusted consultants at Vallent, that relationships are built in times of crisis. It's who's there for you when you need them most that ultimately shakes out the relationships that matter. And so, I don't want to get on a soapbox too much. If you start talking about ethical questions and you're talking to a lawyer, you're probably getting the wrong advice. But I do think this is a time where what should we do, what's the right thing to do, is in the interest of our employees and the long-term interest of our business and the relationships we have. I think that question more often than not will be the more important one than are we able to do it, because I think the law is going to let you be pretty aggressive with whatever legitimate business strategy you have in mind. So to that end, I do say this is a time to shine for many employers, and we shouldn't miss that opportunity to be building relationships with our people in the process. So when we talk about what we should be doing, I think necessarily we look to the national health experts who are constantly speaking on this, whether that's the CDC, which is updating its website almost hourly with new guidance, new advice, whether that's the National Institutes of Health, whether that's the World Health Organization, even the U.S. State Department related to travel issues. I think we've got to put some confidence in them. Remember, the one issue where one way that employers tend to find themselves in trouble is when they start trying to make medical judgments themselves about employment decisions. If you are making a medical judgment yourself without relying on medical advice from either one of these national authorities, or in the event that you need to speak to a trusted health professional of your own, if we make decisions without getting that advice, we're on very flimsy ground when it comes to employment law. So to the extent that you find guidance from the CDC to have gaps, to be gray, we would say seek out the advice of a trusted health professional of your own to get some application of best practices to your unique circumstances. I will tell you that we've had a number of calls in the past week where we've pulled in local health professionals to help weigh in on unique questions, and we are certainly seeing some consensus emerge in how those professionals are giving advice, and we'll fill you in on what we're seeing in that when we get into these FAQs. But make sure that we're separating sort of which hat we wear. Are we making a business decision as an employer wearing our business decision hat, or are we making a health influenced decision? If so, and we're in that doctor cap, we're probably in trouble unless we're a physician or a health professional. So be cautious around those issues. With that, I want to turn it over to my colleague Matthew Canova to start walking us through these FAQs, and we'll have a little dialogue as it relates to these issues.
Thanks, Matt. So we want to start with your employer response plan and kind of some considerations there. Keep in mind that, Matt mentioned to me yesterday that I think he's received an email from every company he's ever purchased anything from over the last few days about their COVID-19 response plan.
Yeah, I really don't care what the company that sold me sneakers is doing to respond to COVID-19.
Right, and I think we're all kind of tempted to say, okay, other companies are doing this, so let's, whether we take their announcement and put our name on it and then send it out, or whether we, think, okay, if they're doing it, then we should be doing the exact same thing. That's not necessarily true. We certainly wouldn't advise, taking theirs, putting your name on it, because that's something that hopefully that they thought through and decided how does it apply to our company. And what is our response need to be for COVID-19? We want you to evaluate all of the relevant considerations that are applicable to your company so that you put in place a response plan that's going to work for you during this time, for you, your employees, your business, and your continued operations. The first step to that is establishing your response team. This needs to be really, kind of the heads of all the departments. From the top of the company and really all the way down as far as necessary to make sure that we're addressing all of those concerns. An important part of the response team, and Matt mentioned it, is a trusted healthcare professional. Now, they're, of course, a little bit overloaded at this time, but if we have a trusted resource that we have used in the past, reaching out to them to see their availability and how they can help, and bouncing some of the questions that you'll have off of them is an important part of that response team. What you want to do is you want to evaluate the risks involved in your workplace and with your workforce, and then assess the resources you have to combat those risks. We're talking about everything from keeping things clean, and hand washing, hand sanitizer, the ability to have outside companies come in and do an extra cleaning. The risk. Again, it's going to be different with every workforce. How close do your employees work with each other? What community are you in, and what is the community spread like? What are your local public officials advising? So all of that goes into really the risk assessment and then the resources we have to fight it. A strategy for communications is very important. Now, today we're focusing primarily on the employment implications of COVID-19. So that's going to deal with our internal communications. But you also want to have someone on the team that's responsible for your external communication. Sending out those emails to your customers and letting them know how you are addressing COVID-19. That can also include if you typically have face-to-face meetings, informing them that we're not going to have those same face-to-face meetings or only as absolutely necessary. I know a step that a lot of businesses that have put in place is a health questionnaire for visitors coming into the office so that they can indicate to the company that they do or do not have any of the health concerns. And that way you're protecting your employees and your company as well as the operations, allowing them to continue. So the personnel policies, I think, are kind of, the biggest piece. Now, we're going to have some existing personnel policies. We need to, really look at those, see, do we have what we want in place within those existing policies to the extent we don't update them. You can update them on a temporary basis. You can update them on a permanent basis. But the important thing is to be aware of what's included in those. If you do not have a telework policy, we would recommend putting one in place. That doesn't mean you necessarily have to implement it already, but you want to be thinking through those considerations to see if it's going to be possible and how best to tackle that. And having a policy in place is extremely important. Most employers have some form of a telework policy already in place. So So hopefully you're not really starting from square one there, but if you're not, you certainly do want to put one in place. But even if you have one already, review it, because typically you're not dealing with telework on a mass scale. So you want to make sure that it's going to work for addressing the COVID-19 concerns that we're seeing. For employee communications, a good practice is to have a point person. That's the point person for internal communications and questions. That's important because we want one voice from the company. We want a consistent message, keeping employees informed. We're dealing with a constantly changing situation. Just over the last 2 weeks, you went from recommending the CDC's hand washing measures to a lot of cities really enforcing effectively a quarantine. And requiring businesses to either completely shut down or restaurants to move to delivery only. So the recommendations are constantly moving. So we want to stay in touch with our employees. And something that's important because there's a lot of, I guess misinformation is probably the best word out there. In particular, if anybody has been on Facebook, there's plenty of stuff out there that maybe 1 or 2% of that is actually true. So we want to avoid what those people are doing, and that's editorializing. We want to look to the trusted authorities on this subject, the CDC, the federal government, state and local governments, and health administrations. We don't want to put our own spin on what's going on. I think something we saw early on, not necessarily from employers, but more just from a little bit the media, but also just the community at large, was taking information and then either making it extreme or saying, we don't think this is a big deal, don't take it seriously. And neither one of those is the correct approach. The correct approach is to communicate what the recognized authorities are on this subject and communicate that to our employees with a calm tone. And Matt mentioned earlier, we can be leaders in this situation. We want to constantly reassure employees not only of the situation, but that we are doing all things necessary to protect our employees and that their health and safety is our number one priority. We mentioned reviewing all of our policies. Once you've done that, we want to remind employees of the policies that we do have in place, including attendance policies. We still need to run our business, and there may be situations where we still need employees to come in. We may move to a completely telework arrangement. But our attendance policies still apply. And so reminding employees that we have these policies in place, pointing them to your handbook, is a good practice in those employee communications. We also want to make clear to employees, and this kind of goes along with what we were talking about with visitors earlier, that if they are experiencing symptoms or if they've been in contact with anybody that's experiencing symptoms, or especially that has been diagnosed as positive with COVID-19, that they inform the employer. That is extremely important. Again, we want to make sure that our workforce is safe, and when we know that an employee has been diagnosed or is experiencing symptoms, we need to distance ourselves distance that employee from the workplace so that we don't create a situation where he's passing on those germs and infecting others in the workplace.
And Matthew, just a quick comment, because we get the question a lot of, what is my legal obligation to my employees, in light of COVID-19, and really the legal obligation is sort of twofold. It's one, the obligation under OSHA to have a safe work environment. We have a duty as employers to provide a safe work environment. The other is sort of the generalized duty to exercise reasonable care toward our employees, and both of these obligations sort of follow the same standard, and it's the standard that that you and I encounter when we approach a stoplight. We stop at the red, we go at the green, and everybody stops at the red and goes at the green. And when somebody does something other than stopping at the red and going at the green, they're negligent, right? And so, I think the reason for that analysis is simply to say, looking around us and taking note of what similarly situated employers in our industries are doing is informative of how we should behave. And I also think that that's a factor that is worth discussing with senior leadership. I've had many calls with some senior leadership folks in the last 7 to 10 days, where I've heard wide and varied opinions about, the nonsense that is the overreaction to the COVID-19 virus, that this is a hoax, that it's a scam, that the scientists just want more fun. I mean, I've heard all kinds of different stuff, right? And we all have opinions about whether this is appropriate or overhyped, but it doesn't matter in terms of our legal obligations to our employees. It doesn't matter. Let your opinions affect how you comport yourself, you conduct yourself in your personal life, your family life, but as it applies to the legal standards for us as employers, our opinion about this just doesn't matter. It's what is the standard by which we will be judged, from a risk management standpoint. And so that's why I think even if we think the reaction to this is overhyped, we've got to be looking at what other similarly situated employers are doing to protect their employees in these circumstances. And I think that's why Matthew's guidance to avoid editorializing in communications is important. Matthew?
And so kind of on those lines in terms of looking to what other businesses are doing, we have seen most companies, and for that matter, the United States, implement limited travel, and in fact, and in most cases, I believe, international travel is essentially shut down to and from the United States unless you're a citizen. So communicate those travel policies, and that includes both company and personal travel. Now, we would encourage employers now to basically suspend company travel unless it's absolutely necessary, but to also consider other options. Can those meetings be done virtually, whether it's a video meeting or a conference call? If it's absolutely necessary, you still have the ability to have company travel. Personal travel is, and we've got a few FAQs on this a little bit later on, but it's a little bit more of a touchy subject, but ultimately we still need to be concerned and we need to be informed when employees are traveling and where they're traveling to, because there are certain high-risk areas. So requiring employees to keep the employer informed of their travel is something important, and again, we have to communicate that to employees to make sure that they are aware of the limitations and policies that we have in place, make sure that we are aware of the travel that they are, the places that they are traveling to, so that we can avoid those risks. Work from home. It's something that some employers have really embraced this already over the last several years, and some are being put in a situation where they may not have much of a choice of embracing it. But there are a lot of considerations. We do want to evaluate, is this possible for our business at all? Is it possible for some employees and not others? Because there are going to be some positions that it is just not possible for them to do their work from home. That may mean that we need to have them continue coming into work. That may mean that we're just going to allow them to take the time off during this time, or it may be that we adjust their job responsibilities to allow them to at least perform certain extremely important and crucial functions from home, and maybe not have those other functions. But again, if we need them to be in the office, currently at least, we still have the ability to require that. We want to consider, is that a viable option for our workforce? To do that, we're going to have to evaluate what resources and infrastructure that we have. Everybody is going to have, virtually everybody is going to have internet access, both at work and at home. But the ability to remote in to their computers at work, or do they need to use their own personal devices at home, evaluating what resources we have and what we may need to put in place is extremely important to allow for telework. If you have those systems, or once you get those systems in place, test those systems. Our firm had a stress test on the system earlier this week, where basically we asked everybody to log in remotely and see if our system was going to be able to handle it. And to my knowledge, it handled it perfectly. So we are our systems are in place and will work fine through this crisis. But we want to make sure that you test your systems to avoid a situation where we do move to telework, and then when we finally have that going, all of a sudden the system crashes, and now we're in a situation where we're scrambling yet again. So once we put that in place, or if we already have it in place, let's test those systems to know that they'll work fine during the crisis. So this is something that is not a new problem, but it's made a little bit more difficult given the recent changes to the white-collar exemptions, but we do need to track hours for non-exempt employees. Well, given the new rules that we had recently, we might have a lot of employees that were previously exempt that are now classified as non-exempt because the salary basis threshold changed, and we need to be able to track those hours. Now, we need to be able to track those hours for non-exempt employees that were previously non-exempt, and even if this wasn't going on, we would still need to be tracking those hours for the new non-exempt employees. But kind of given that that was already a transition and we were getting used to that, and now if we move to telework, tracking hours can be more difficult. So developing a system to be able to track those hours is important for the FLSA to make sure that we continue paying those employees for their hours worked. Performance expectations are very important. I think people tend to look at telework as saying, okay, I'm working from home, I'm not really working as hard. Well, that's not true. I mean, we really can still maintain business operations, and that's the goal of being able to telework, is still maintain business operations, hopefully at the same level, but certainly we still need to be performing our work, so we need to communicate those expectations to employees, keeping in mind that there are going to be some increased difficulties here. Maybe when somebody normally works from home, it's just them at home, and during this time there may be children at home. So of course we want to be reasonable and understanding to employees' circumstances, but that does not mean that we don't have expectations of them continuing to perform their work and perform their work at a high level. All right, so getting to those FAQs, a few questions that we've been receiving around work from home and telework arrangements. If we implement telework, do we have to pay for the employee's internet service or provide them with a device or a computer for them to be able to work from home? The answer there is no. Employees are expected to be, are reasonably expected to have the necessary internet service. We're not required to put that in place for them. Now, we do, again, want to be considerate here. We think it's going to be rare that the internet service is an issue, but a device may be something that employees are not going to have, or at least not have a computer that maybe has the necessary security, but also performance level to be able to remote in. So consider what resources we have and if we are able to provide certain equipment to employees. But again, that's not an obligation of the company. If we allow some employees to work from home, do we have to allow all employees to work from home? The answer is no. We're looking at reasonable requirements for employees, and is it consistent with a business necessity? We need to evaluate. Now, when we treat employees differently, we always have to make sure that that is a non-discriminatory basis on which we're making that decision. But ultimately, there's no requirement that if we allow some employees to work from home, we have to allow all employees. That's going to be I won't say an individual by individual determination. I would really say more a position by position based on the type of work that they're doing and can it be done from home. Our local schools just closed, and a lot of us are dealing with that. The employees' children are not sick, but they have no child care. What do we do? Again, and now Matt will talk about this in a little bit, the new law that has been, well, the new bill really that has been passed by the House may change this a little bit. Matt will address those questions later, but there's no requirement for us to allow telework if an employee has children now that have been released from school. But again, we're trying to lead by example here and make this as easy on employees as possible. So we want to consider whether that may be something we want to put in place is telework for employees that are going to have children at home. Again, we still can maintain our performance expectations, and we want to make sure that we're communicating those. But legally, there is no requirement, at least not yet. And even if there is a requirement under this new rule, there are, of course, certain limitations and strings attached to that. But generally, there's not going to be a legal requirement for us to allow an employee to work from home if they have children that are out of school. Health inquiries. This is something that I think is probably at the forefront of everybody's mind right now. The ADA typically says, no, you cannot have health inquiries that involve disability-related inquiries or medical examinations. The EEOC has special rules in the event of a pandemic, but The normal rule is that you can really only have these disability-related inquiries if it is job-related and consistent with a business necessity, or if we have a reasonable belief that the employee poses a direct threat to the health and safety of our workforce or other individuals. So we're still looking at our decisions through that lens, but the pandemic rules from the EEOC does allow a little bit more flexibility, and it has been declared a pandemic at this point. So we're working under that slightly more flexible framework. But we want to encourage employers to really still look at it through the lens of the normal standards, but with the understanding that there is some heightened concern here, and we do have those more flexible standards in approaching issues with our employees that are potentially sick. So if we have an employee that's exhibiting symptoms, what can we require of them? Can we make that employee get tested, and who pays? The answer there is yes. If they are exhibiting symptoms, including whether they disclose those or whether we see that they're exhibiting symptoms, or as we mentioned earlier, we can ask disability-related questions related to those symptoms to learn more information. We can require that sick employee to get tested. Kind of our general recommendation here, we talked about earlier, the CDC's guidance for a medical professional. It is not our decision on what temperature should raise alarms. We want to look to the trusted resources for that and medical professionals to determine if an employee is exhibiting the symptoms established by the CDC and whether we want to get that employee tested.
That's great advice, Matthew. We've had the question through the chat tab, and I'm getting it regularly. Can we post someone at the door to check employee temperatures before they come into work? And the answer is yes, probably. And you want to make sure that the decision to do so is based on the perceived threat that someone who's COVID-19 positive poses to the workplace, and your duty to provide a safe workplace. But we wouldn't want to just pull some medical threshold for what constitutes a fever off the internet. We'd want to be relying on medical professionals' guidance for what should be considered a threatening fever, and what even a fever constitutes. And even medical science seems to be varied on that. But you want to be relying on a medical professional's determination as to what the standard should be. And if you decide that that's something important for you to do, and you think that there is in fact a perceived risk, what are you doing to protect the person taking the temperatures, right? In other words, make sure that your strategy for how you implement the temperature taking lines up with the business case for why you're taking the temperature, i.e. that there's a risk, right? So it's permissible, but we want to make sure that we're doing so based not on fear and panic, but rather on medical recommendations.
Another question we've been getting is, should we encourage employees that are at risk based on their age or pre-existing health condition to stay home? The answer here is really no. We do have some limitations in place that prevent us from doing that. We have the ADEA and the ADA that's going to prevent us from treating those individuals differently. Now, certainly if those employees approach us about those concerns, then we can really essentially create a reasonable accommodation to allow whether it's work from home or the request to be granted. But we don't want to approach those employees directly. We need to be thinking about our workforce sort of as a whole, as opposed to kind of identifying those individuals and treating them differently, because it could result in some employment claims. I know we're thinking about doing the right thing there, but ultimately it creates some risk. And one thing that we're seeing in the community is that those people that are more at risk are taking kind of their own health in their hands, and so they're likely to ask those questions of you. So certainly when they bring those questions to you, you can make arrangements for them.
And look, Matthew, on the testing question, I just want to be clear. You as an employer have the right to tell someone who's exhibiting symptoms, you need to go get tested. You've got a legal right to do that. I would strongly discourage it. I see health care providers strongly discouraging it. And the reason that there's quite a debate about testing, and there's one set of healthcare providers that says we need more testing so we know how many people are infected. There's another part of the testing debate that says there's nothing we can do for 90% of the people who test positive other than tell them the same thing we told them before they got tested, which is if you have symptoms, self-isolate, take good care of yourself, drink water, et cetera, and if you end up with an emergency, call the hospital. But they even want you to call ahead before you come in to get tested so they can isolate you then. And the testing so overtasks the healthcare system that I think you have to be very careful about requiring that. First of all, if someone is positive, they go in without calling ahead, they expose other people, potentially healthcare professionals, to the disease. They risk exposing themselves to other people in line to get tested. And the tests themselves, we've seen, have only had 70% efficacy. That means that 1 out of every 3 tests is giving either a false positive or a false negative. That's a pretty low threshold for reliability on testing. And so I think this emphasis on testing, I think it runs the risk of backfiring for employers. For example, I've even talked to people, and we'll talk about with the FMLA, but I've even got some clients that have said, so that we don't overtask the healthcare system with people who are asking for FMLA leave, we're conditionally approving it and telling you, we'll give you 45 days, 60 days, what have you, to get the certification back to us. We don't want you to go rushing into a doctor to get a certification and stressing out the system that way. So I think it goes to that question of, yes, we can require someone to get tested. Should we? And those questions will keep coming up.
And I think we've got a follow-up question on this from the chat. So back to the first item here, who pays? The answer really is if we require them to go to a particular medical professional, so we select a medical provider here, then we would need to pay for that test. Now, we don't have an obligation if we just say to get the test and they can really go to the provider of their choice. Now, again, kind of with the theme of today, what can you do, what should you do? We would encourage employers to cover that. Now, I will say, I don't exactly know how it works yet from the federal government, but they have said that all people in America will be able to get a test if they need one, and they won't have to pay for it. So I'm not sure how that's going to work from the federal government standpoint. The new law, and Matt will cover it in more detail, but does have requirements for all health plans to cover testing. We've also seen insurance companies agree to cover that, and even TPA, or insurance companies that are acting as TPAs for self-funded plans, have said that they will cover it even under self-funded plans that don't amend the plan to cover that testing. So to summarize that, so that the rule is generally, unless it's our chosen healthcare provider, then we are not obligated to pay for it, but there are going to be some other things in place, especially if the employee is covered under our health plan, but potentially from the federal government that will cover the cost of that. All right, let's talk about liability. And again, we're focusing on kind of in-house liability from employees and claims based on our workplace. What obligations do we have to protect employees? And Matt mentioned this earlier, we have an obligation to provide a reasonably safe environment for these employees to work. OSHA has given us standards for providing a reasonably safe environment to work, and then specific to COVID-19. We want to look at what other businesses are doing, what the community is recommending in order to show and to meet those standards that would support our position that we are taking reasonable steps to provide that reasonably safe environment. But what's going to be necessary for your particular workplace, again, depends on your particular circumstances. Can an employee sue us if they get COVID-19 at work? Well, one thing we've been thinking is, the answer to that direct question is yes. Right? An employee, or anybody for that matter, can sue us for anything. Whether that's likely to be a successful claim depends on what have we done to provide that reasonably safe environment. Are we following the guidelines from the authorities? We think it's probably pretty unlikely, again, if we're taking those reasonable steps, for an employee to have a successful claim. And also, if we think about sort of the reality of the situation, it would be very difficult for an employee to prove that they contracted COVID-19 from the workplace. Obviously, authorities are encouraging everybody to keep distance from each other, to stay indoors as much as possible, not to go out in the community. So it'd be very difficult, given those circumstances, for them to show that it was contracted at work. But our obligation is to provide that reasonably safe work environment. And if we're following those standards that have been set up, and again, kind of looking at our unique circumstances and making sure that we're providing that reasonably safe work environment, then it's unlikely that an employee would have a successful claim. If we have an employee that tests positive, do we have to just shut down our workplace? The answer is no. Now, of course, again, we have an obligation to provide that reasonably safe environment, and we need to evaluate those circumstances. But generally, if we can take steps to, even after we've had an employee test positive, maintain a safe workplace so we would not have to close. OSHA, again, has guidance on keeping your place reasonably safe, specific to COVID-19. Some steps that we've seen recommended if you do have an employee test positive is to reach out to the employee to obtain information, including who have they worked around in close proximity. I think 6 feet is the rule there. What work areas do they work in? And then making sure that we take steps to clean those areas, to inform those other individuals that that we've had an employee test positive and that they need to self-isolate for the 14-day period. And that way, again, we're taking reasonable steps to maintain a safe workplace, to inform those individuals so that they can take the proper care, and so that they are self-isolating so that they, to the extent they have been infected, will not continue to spread that through our workplace. Can an employee refuse to work or come to work is the bigger concern because they're afraid to get COVID-19? The answer there, well, and I will say, the answer to pretty much any question that is ever asked of a lawyer is it depends. But OSHA gives an employee the ability to refuse to come to work in very limited circumstances, and it's a very high standard. There has to be a reasonable threat of imminent danger. If we are following OSHA's guidelines, we are following CDC's guidelines, and we are taking steps to ensure that we have a reasonably safe workplace, the objections of an employee to come to work are not going to rise to that level. And the guidance is pretty clear in that area. Again, we do have to be taking those steps to ensure that reasonably safe workplace. But absent a reasonable threat of imminent danger, employees do not have the ability to refuse to come to work. Is there any difference for union employees? And I'm going to point this one over to Matt, but generally we're going to look to the CBA to control all of those decisions when we're talking about union employees.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately we manage to our CBAs in a union environment, and when the union pushes back, the question is what contract terms in the union CBA govern this issue. Employers who are implementing relief strategies right now, obviously remember that if you've got a union, and this is not a relief strategy that is expressly dealt with in your CBA, you've got an obligation to give advance notice and an opportunity to bargain over that response to the union. In most instances we've seen, because of the nature of the response, unions have been quick to say, go with it. We don't need to bargain. So I think they've been pretty flexible. I think building on one of the questions that you've got up there is a question we have on the chat tab. If you have an employee in the high-risk category approach you about staying home and their job can't be done remotely, what should you do? It's one thing when an employee says, I've got a generalized fear or panic about exposure and I don't want to come to work, right? Unfortunately, as reasonable as that generalized fear might be, as a legal matter, you've got the right to say you're expected to be at work if someone's not sick and doesn't have a protection for being sick under the FMLA or otherwise have the ability to take leave under one of your existing policies, you've got the ability to say, tough luck, you got to be here. I do think that it gets a little trickier for us where an individual employee calls you and says, look, I've got one of these comorbidities. I've got high blood pressure. I've got diabetes. I'm over the age of 70. I've got one of these underlying health conditions that says this could be particularly terrible for me if I'm exposed to it. In those circumstances, it does seem possible that their underlying health condition may qualify as a serious health condition. If you're an employer subject to FMLA, if they're an employee subject to FMLA, I think that we would recommend in that situation, again, an employee telling you they're concerned about coming to work due to an underlying health condition, that makes them a substantially higher risk of the disease. I think in those cases I might be inclined to treat it as FMLA. I certainly think that would probably be a safer approach. Again, that's as a minimum standard for compliance with the law. If we get into the should question and you think the right thing to do is to protect anybody who might be vulnerable, you might go a step further. But I think the law there is probably one that may not be obvious on its face because of these comorbidity implications. Matthew?
So moving on to PTO and sick leave, and this is another area where it is a little bit fluid given the potential new law, but the current law or current bill that's been passed by the House. The first three questions here are really kind of all, we can roll those all into one. We've got an employee that has not been diagnosed but believes that they have COVID-19 as their self-quarantine. What do we do? Do we have to pay that employee? Can we require a doctor's excuse? If an employee is exhibiting symptoms and believes that they have it, the right thing to do is to self-quarantine. We can require a doctor's excuse. Matt's mentioned a few times with FMLA that we can conditionally certify that and then expand the window that we would normally have for them obtaining that doctor's excuse. We would encourage employers not to immediately require a doctor's excuse right now, given one, that healthcare providers are a little bit overloaded, and also we really don't want to put an employee into a situation where they have to, if they do have it, go out in the public where they can potentially infect others, or maybe if they're just concerned because they may think they have symptoms, and we're making them go into a doctor's office where there very likely has been somebody there that has been diagnosed with positive results. So we would encourage you to be hesitant with requiring a doctor's note, at least a doctor's note immediately. Do we have to pay them? This is going to be, and again, a little bit potentially different depending on the law if it passes, but under the current circumstances, we're going to look at, is this an exempt employee or non-exempt employee? And we're really working under the normal rules that we have in place under the FLSA during any other time of the year and even when this stuff's not going on. If it is a non-exempt hourly employee, we're only required to pay those employees for their hours worked. So if an employee is not working, then a non-exempt employee is not working, then we don't have to pay them for that time. If it is an exempt employee that's paid on a salary basis and they have performed any work in that week, then we are required to pay their full salary for that week. So when looking at whether we have to pay that employee, we need to look at their particular situation and are they exempt or non-exempt. Here we are. Let's see, it's Wednesday. It's hard to keep track of them when we're like this and it's a ghost town. But it's Wednesday, so very likely if an employee was to call today and they're going to self-quarantine because they're worried that they have it, and it's an exempt employee, very likely they have worked already this week. So that would mean we need to pay them their full salary this week, but that rule does not apply when we're talking about non-exempt employees.
Let me just cut to the chase on a series of questions that we keep getting, and I want to head it off at the pass. And the question, there's really two variations on it, Matthew. The first is, what if we find out that one of our employees has tested positive? What's our duty there? And this is one of those issues that I would say is specific to your workspace and probably best answered by a health professional. But what I can relate to you is that we've been on enough of these calls at this point that we're hearing a pattern from the health professionals. If an employee tests positive, you should contact the employee. And in addition to wishing them well and making sure that that employment issue is dealt with, whether through the policies that Matthew's discussed or otherwise, you should ask them who in the last 14 days have they worked with in close proximity within 6 feet or less, and what workspaces have they worked in. The next step then, according to the health professionals, would be to contact the individual that employee identified as being someone they worked with in close proximity and to instruct that those individuals self-quarantine for 14 days. The next step would then be to access the workspaces that they used during that 14-day period and use an environmental services crew to do a deep clean on those areas. And look, you may say, well, Stiles, that sounds totally overboard. Or maybe you think, Stiles, that doesn't sound like enough. I again would say this is a health professional question ultimately. And CDC has not given express guidance on this, neither is OSHA, but that's what we have consistently heard from the health professionals. Taking that question a step further, an employee calls you and says, my spouse or my child or a member of my household has tested positive. What do I do? The health professionals have consistently said to us in that circumstance that your employee should stay in self-quarantine for 14 days, but that the potential exposure to someone exposed, right? I guess that's second-degree exposure. Potential exposure to someone exposed is not something that should be reported to others or should trigger any self-quarantine obligations for those individuals. If the employee then calls you back and says, well, we knew it was going to happen, I've now tested positive, then the question would start again to that employee, well, who were you in immediate contact with at the workplace for the last 14 days? What work areas did you work in? And then we should go down the path of that self-quarantine. We're trying to do that without disclosing the name of the employee. The only thing that would apply to us in that context is the ADA, which says that we're supposed to keep employee health information as confidential as possible in light of business needs and circumstances. So it certainly is possible that an employee is going to figure out real quick who it was that tested positive, but we don't want to be dragging someone's name through the mud. I'll take that scenario one step further. Vigilante employees, I shouldn't call them vigilante employees, but an employee in one of those two scenarios, right, knows that they have been in contact with someone who tested positive or themselves has tested positive, and employee instantly then decides to send an email or call everybody and say, hey, I've either been in contact with someone who's tested positive or I am positive. I just wanted to let you know. I think those are the scenarios we've got to try to get a hold of as quickly as possible in HR, because remember, as part of providing a safe work environment, it's not just protecting employees from actual illnesses, but it's actually also protecting them from the panic and fear of a perceived illness. So we don't want to go off half-cocked on these things. So I think that's why, to the extent that we have an employee who believes they've been exposed or has tested positive, we want them to notify us, because we want to try and control that messaging to provide a safe environment, but also to reduce the panic and unnecessary fear. So I know that's a scenario that had sort of overlapping series of questions there, but it's a scenario that I'm seeing a lot right now, and I thought dealing with it in bulk might get us where we need to go. Back to you, Matthew.
One last question on this slide. So let's say we have a PTO policy. It's a very generous PTO policy, but if everybody uses it at once, it's going to break the company. We need to continue our operation. Can we change our policy? Again, kind of with the caveat that we'll say a lot today, the new law has some limitations there, but I believe at least the most recent version that I've reviewed, which may be old news at this point, but it does limit our ability to change our PTO policy after enactment. Well, it has not been enacted yet. So if we do want to reevaluate our policies, and like we talked about earlier, we think that's a good idea to review them and determine whether we want to keep them as they are. Do we need to amend, whether temporarily or permanently? We need to do it now. And there is no problem changing the PTO policy to, again, reflect the circumstances here. We again, want to encourage employers to be as flexible as they can with employees during this time. But we do have to ensure our continued operation. So looking to our policies and changing them temporarily to respond to the outbreak is permissible. So let's say that we're in a situation where we want to tell employees to stay at home and not come to work. Do we have to pay them? That goes back to our earlier answers. What is the employee exempt or non-exempt? If they are non-exempt and they're an hourly worker, we only have to pay them for the hours worked. If they are an exempt employee, we do have to pay them in any week in which they perform work. Right now, this week, if they perform work, we likely would. Now, if they do not perform any work, let's say next week, and we're in this situation, then we would not be required to pay them in that the salary because they had not performed any work in that particular work week. If we are going to have some layoffs and a reduced workforce, what are our obligations? There's a federal law called WARN. There's also state WARN laws, but they generally track the federal law.
We don't have one in Alabama.
If we are subject to WARN, then there are notice obligations. The notice window is 60 days, but there are some emergency notice exceptions there, and I think we would fall under that. But we need to provide as much reasonably advanced notice as we can. If we are not covered by WARN, do we have to provide any notice to employees? And the answer there is no, but again, we want to be reasonable. We want to provide as much notice as possible to employees so that they can make or evaluate their circumstances and make arrangements, whether it's for another job, potential income, or looking into their financial issues, their children. So we just want to provide as much notice as we can, whether or not we're required to under WARN.
And real quick on WARN, remember that you got to have 100 employees before you're even covered. And I wouldn't even worry about WARN unless you're going to lose 50 employees or more at a single site of employment. That's the lowest threshold that might trigger a consideration of WARN obligations. Sites with larger numbers of employees, the threshold could be higher to trigger WARN than 50. But 50 is at the point where I would start talking to council about what this might mean for you. One other question I want to tackle that we're getting consistently is related to exempt employees who have been out. If you got an exempt employee, remember under the FLSA, salaried exempt employees, if they work any part of a work week, they have to get their FLSA salary for that work week. You may, as an employer, require that they charge time to their PTO bank, unworked time to their PTO bank in that work week, until such time as the PTO is exhausted. You have a right to do so. If, however, let's say the employee works a little bit on Monday, is out Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday due to a COVID-19 issue, they use up their last 2 PTO days on Tuesday and Wednesday, and Thursday and Friday they have no PTO to charge it to. Under the FLSA, you still got to pay them their full salary for those days. I mean, legally, you'd have the right to discipline them for taking PTO that they don't have, but I don't know anybody in this context who's going to do that. But legally, you've got to pay that salaried exempt employee their salary for the work week in which they perform any amount of work, but you have that ability again to make them charge it to their PTO, their vacation, their sick leave banks. Okay, sorry, over to you, Matthew.
So let's talk about the FMLA, which again, a very fluid situation given the potential new law and the expansion there. Should we approve FMLA with or without a physician certification? Under normal circumstances, we certainly require that. You can still require it now. We would just encourage employers to be patient with it, expand the window, preliminarily approve it, and then have the physician certification. Again, if we still want to require it, just be patient on getting that. Don't require employees to immediately go to a physician, putting themselves and others at risk. So this FMLA, the second question here, very similar answer to what we've said. If an employee has fears about their own health, but not that they have COVID-19, but maybe that they're worried they might be more susceptible to it or worried about getting it. We're still looking at the same rules we've been talking about. Employees cannot refuse to come to work unless there's an imminent threat of danger, and we can require them to come to work. Again, we're required to provide a reasonably safe work environment. But as long as we're doing that, then we can require that employees still come into work. We do want to encourage, again, some flexibility, trying to make arrangements depending on the circumstances. But ultimately, we have a right to run our business, and really what's going on doesn't change that. So we do have the ability to require them to come to work over their objections as long as they don't rise to that high level under the OSHA standards of a threat of imminent danger. We mentioned earlier travel policies. What do we want to do with regard to company travel and personal travel? So let's talk more about some of the questions that we're getting around travel. Do we have the right to ask an employee where they're traveling to or from? And let's say a personal vacation. Yes. an employer's jurisdiction does not end when an employee leaves the workplace, right? Especially given times like this where we have an obligation to ensure a reasonably safe work environment, and we need to know what risks our workforce faces. So we can ask those questions about employees' personal travel. There are certain state laws that limit our ability to prohibit private conduct. I don't believe any of those laws that we've seen would prohibit the employer from asking those questions, but there are some laws that limit an employer's ability to ask, or excuse me, to limit personal conduct and things that are not unlawful. Those are going to typically be private causes of action, which are going to be viewed on a reasonable standard. So even in this situation, if there was a law that did apply and did limit the employer's ability to do that, the circumstances would likely justify it and eliminate any cause of action there. Can we prohibit employees from traveling? Again, absent any state law that would limit an employer's ability to do so, yes, we can limit, or we can prohibit employees from traveling. How do we do that? I mean, effectively, employees are going to do what they want to do, but if we have a policy in place that we're prohibiting employees from traveling, we can take whatever normal employment actions that we would otherwise take, whether it's suspension, termination, or any other form of discipline, but we can prohibit employees from business and personal travel. What if we have an employee that has traveled to a foreign country and is now closed off and can't get home? We've talked about this a few times, so we're looking back to their exempt and non-exempt status. If they're exempt and they performed any work in that week, then we are required to pay them for the full week. If they're an hourly employee and they're not working, then we're not required to pay them for time not working. Now, if they're in that closed-off country but they're still able to work, then we do need to continue paying them for the hours worked. But otherwise, we would not be required to pay them. Again, kind of going back to our overall theme today, we would encourage, if we do have an hourly employee that is now stuck in another country, especially if they were there for business reasons, then we would encourage employers to continue paying them at least for their normal wages during that time for what they normally would have worked. But also, again, consider the telework options. Hopefully that won't disrupt your operation. Is their ability, I mean, almost everybody's going to have a computer with them or at a minimum a cell phone. And so if they're able to continue performing any of their job functions while being in that closed-off country or area, we could, and we want to continue paying them, we could continue to have them working so that we're getting some benefit. If an employee refuses to travel, any business travel, out of fears for COVID-19, that's really the same concerns as can we require them to come into the office. But again, looking at the current environment, we would encourage employers to seriously consider options that do not involve travel, certainly travel to any at-risk areas. Almost everything can be done by phone or video conferencing if it needs to be a meeting where you want that face-to-face, but everybody's going to understand the circumstances. So we would encourage you to consider those other options. But if it is travel that is absolutely necessary, then the same rules apply. And again, as long as we are not placing an employee under a immediate and imminent danger, then they do not have the ability to refuse that work travel. So thinking a little outside the employment context here and looking to us as a business, our commercial contracts and the clauses that are in those contracts, the force majeure clause in particular, if we've got business contracts that we may be unable to perform given the effects of COVID-19, or we have vendors that are unable to perform services for us, or in a lot of situations, we have vendors that are unable to perform for us, which means that we are now unable to perform for our customers. What do we do? Is there any flexibility under that contract? Do we have a force majeure clause that would relieve us of the obligation to perform under that contract? The answer, again, it depends. So you're going to want to review those contracts to look at the specific language. Something somebody said the other day on a call is that force majeure clauses are typically boilerplate. Nobody really pays attention to them in contracts except for the lawyers that drafted that contract. But now, that boilerplate is now, becoming very important. So looking at what the clause says and seeing how it's going to apply in these circumstances is going to determine whether those contracts are enforceable from the standpoint of immediate performance of those obligations. We will say, and this is kind of a good thing about the community sort of coming together, the clients that we've discussed having concerns here, most of the time both parties to that contract understand the circumstances are going to work something out. So a lot of times these potential issues can be resolved reasonably, and it's really just working together with the other side. But ultimately, if there is a situation where we are unable to perform and we cannot work it out otherwise, then we would need to look to those particular contracts to see what rights and obligations we still have under those. With the idea that that could potentially cause us some liability, we want to look to the insurance policies that we have in place, our general commercial liability policies. What coverage do we have for those? And then do we have any business disruption insurance that may cover any losses that occur if we are unable to perform, or again, if vendors or service providers to us are unable to perform their services. So let's move on to benefits. When we're thinking about a health crisis here, it seems like benefits would really be at the forefront, and they are. There's a lot of benefits considerations taken into account, but of course, like we talked about today, really there's a lot of external concerns with our business, but in particular, for everybody on the call today, and then really just for businesses in general, the concerns, the employment law concerns and their workforce is really at the forefront in their minds, and the immediate priorities, because we want to ensure their health and safety, but we do need to continue operating as a business. So we want to talk about a few of these benefits considerations and how is it going to affect our benefits plan. The bill that's been passed by the House currently would require that all group health plans cover COVID-19 testing. The language is a little unclear on whether it would require treatment to be covered or just the treatment that's in connection with the testing. We think that likely will be interpreted on a more limited basis to be, testing and then anything that's necessary for the testing, but not necessarily the treatment after the fact. But again, that would apply to all group health plans, self-funded, fully insured, grandfathered, non-grandfathered. We're waiting to see if that's going to become law. There's not been, or we've not at least seen announced about a lot of debate on that particular provision. So we do expect whatever form of law is put in place to have some sort of requirement. Just exactly what the details of that requirement will be remains to be seen, but we'll certainly keep an eye on that, and so will your Valiant Group consultants. Employer mandate compliance. So this is something that we do want to take into account. Ultimately, depending on what circumstances we're facing and whether we are moving to a telework situation, whether we shut down our operations temporarily, whether employees are on leave, there may not be a ton we can do to control some of those aspects, but there are some effects that will occur for our employer mandate compliance. The W-2 safe harbor, we've really been kind of preaching for the last several years that it has a lot of strings attached, and it can create issues, especially for employees that go out on leave. Under normal circumstances, we're going to have certain employees that go on FMLA leave during the year, or even other unpaid leave. And think about what that means for the W-2. If you have a period where where you're not receiving pay, that's going to affect the dollar number on your W-2 at the end of the year. But the W-2 safe harbor is based on our W-2 income. And if we continue charging premiums during that time, which the strings attached to the W-2 safe harbor almost require that we do unless we just move to completely zero if it's percentage-based, which means we would be providing the full premium for the employee, then it's very likely going to throw off our W-2 safe harbor. So we do think that employers may consider moving to the other safe harbors, the FPL safe harbor or the rate of pay safe harbor, given that this could cause some sort of mass confusion for employers that are using the W-2 safe harbor. So if you are using the W-2 safe harbor, it's a good time to evaluate that, potentially revisit it and change it. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to. And we also may see some relief from the government. I'm I'm keeping an eye out, hoping that they're going to issue a release for employer mandate reporting because that deadline is at the end of the month. While this may feel like it shouldn't affect that all that much, ultimately employers that still have not filed and now are dealing with vendors that may have operations at a limited capacity, it could affect that. So we're hoping to see an announced deadline. And even if we don't see that announced deadline, we will want to kind of reassure employers that we would expect to see some flexibility from the IRS on the back end if we were to miss those deadlines. That's not to say that, don't worry about the deadlines, but if we make reasonable efforts to meet it, and given the response to COVID-19, we're unable to meet it, we would certainly think that's a reasonable basis to challenge those penalties. How are carriers responding? As of today, I believe all carriers have agreed to cover the testing, and even carriers that act as TPAs have agreed to cover the testing. Again, depending on if this law goes through and what form it goes through, we would expect that all group health plans are going to be required to cover the testing, but we do know that insurance carriers have been willing to provide that testing on a no-cost basis. If employees are no longer working, are they still entitled to group health plan coverage? Same rules apply. If we have an employee that is no longer working, so that means they're going to lose coverage under the terms of our health plan, well, that's loss of coverage due to a reduction in hours, which is a COBRA qualifying event. So we would need to offer COBRA to those employees. Also, if an employee is on FMLA, whether typical FMLA under normal circumstances where they are out for a serious health condition, then FMLA, the normal rules are going to apply. Of course, the expanded rules under the new law, if it goes through, would apply there as well, and we are required to continue group health plan coverage while somebody is on FMLA leave. So again, the normal rules apply. They feel like they're different. They feel like it's a different circumstance because of just all the, for lack of a better word, kind of panic and reaction to COVID-19. But ultimately, the normal rules apply in that situation. Can a quarantine employee receive disability benefits? We've received this question kind of in a bunch of different forms. Remember that we have all different types of disability benefits out there. Now, I believe most of us are going to be in Alabama, and Alabama does not have state-mandated short-term disability benefits from employers. But ultimately, it's going to depend on how is disability defined under your plan or under whatever the benefits we're looking at are if you're in a state that does have mandated state disability benefits. It's going to depend on the terms of that plan. So we want to look to that, see how it's defined, and see if an employee that's quarantined and for what period of time, if that qualifies as a disability for purposes of those benefits. A few changes we have seen announced, because we mentioned a lot of this is in limbo as we're waiting on the on Congress to potentially pass this law.
And I'm going to get to that in just a minute.
It's from the IRS, and they have said that high-deductible health plans may provide testing prior to an individual meeting the deductible without it invalidating the plan's high-deductible health plan status. Normally, if we provide benefits prior to the deductible, it could destroy that status, which means that employees contributing to an HSA would now be disqualified. But the IRS has said that they will not, or providing testing will not cause a high-deductible health plan to lose its HDHP status. Again, as we mentioned, the new law would mandate this to be a covered benefit, and so that's just kind of building on the ability of plans to provide it. It would require it there. But even if that piece is left out of the law, high-deductible health plans may cover it, but under the current guidance, we are not required to cover that testing prior to the deductible. Matt's talked a few times about information that we get about an employee and taking into account the confidentiality requirements. We want to, and Valiant always provides HIPAA training every year, and they, so if you participated in those HIPAA training, you know that we wear different hats, right? There's kind of this legal fiction that's created by HIPAA where it treats the health plan, the group health plan, differently than the plan sponsor, and really, even in that respect, different than the employer, right? We know that that's kind of a legal fiction. In most circumstances, the plan is administered by the plan sponsor, who is the employer, right? So really the same people are doing the same things. They're just wearing different hats. When we wear our plan hat, when we obtain PHI through our health plan, we are not the employer. So there are limitations on whether we can use that information for other functions as an employer. There is some support under the regulations for us being able to use this. Now, normally when we're talking about this, there are some extreme limitations on our ability to use it, right? But there are some rules under the regulations that are not all directed at this type of situation, but can be used in this situation. Now, there are some that are specific for pandemics, but we're more looking at that as disclosing PHI, and by PHI I mean information from our health plan, and in this context, that we learn that an employee has tested positive for COVID-19. What can we do as an employer? There are some rules that would allow us to disclose that to public health authorities, and that is kind of geared towards this type of a situation. There are a few rules that likely were put in place more for situations, and we've all probably heard of similar rules, where if a psychiatrist or a doctor hears of somebody that intends to cause harm to themselves or another, they have the ability to disclose that information. So that's what the rules that would allow that healthcare provider to disclose that information are not necessarily designed for this situation, but they are drafted broadly enough that we think they could apply, and a few of them apply to covered entities as a whole as opposed to just healthcare providers. So if we learn of information from our plan, so it's PHI, and we have a good faith belief that they pose a serious threat to anyone, I mean, and in this context meaning our workforce, we can use that information. And what that really means is we, as the plan, can disclose that information to we, the employer, and the employer can then take action on that. Given the circumstances right now, the environment that we're in, the overwhelming response from the government, including CMS and HHS, who would be the ones to enforce HIPAA rules, we don't see this as a big risk. If an employer learns that they have a COVID-19 case, we think that the employer should take immediate action and take all the steps that we've discussed here today. Does that mean that we're going to disclose that to everybody? Well, no. Just like Matt talked about earlier, we still have other confidentiality requirements and concerns in place beyond HIPAA. But we do think it's necessary to take immediate action. And keep in mind that we always have the minimum necessary standard. And to the extent that this action was scrutinized, we do think it would be very important to maintain compliance with the minimum necessary standard, because ultimately that's sort of a backdrop of HIPAA, is that, okay, there was a situation where you absolutely felt justified in using it, and again, there is some support under the regs for that, but you only use the minimum necessary amount of PHI for the intended purpose. And if we're complying with that piece of the rule, then we ultimately see it as being very low risk in terms of liability. And a reminder, as we've talked about before on the HIPAA training calls, that there is no private cause of action under HIPAA. So what we're really looking at is potential liability from CMS, and given the environment today, and given that we will be using this information to protect individuals, we see that as a very low risk course of action. So real quick, we want to talk just briefly about 401ks. Look to your plan. You may have the ability to make hardship distributions, also plan loans. So that's going to depend on your plan documents. We also would expect that the government will issue guidance allowing plans to consider this to be a hardship. We see that a lot after natural disasters like tornadoes or hurricanes in an area. So we would expect that to see it, and maybe even nationwide here. But that'll depend a little bit on government guidance, but also primarily on your plan documents. So if that's something that may be available to your employees, then you could inform them of that. Look to your plan documents and evaluate if that is available. So now I will pass it over to Matt to talk about the new
House Relief Bill. Yeah, the House Relief Bill. I'm going to, just so you know, it's just Matt and Matthew here today, but those of you who've been asking questions on the chat tab, it may look like you're getting answers from our colleague Seth Capper. That was me while Matthew was talking. It's about to be Matthew while I'm talking. Now that we've reached the end of sort of the FAQs component to the webinar, If there are questions about specific employer COVID-19 responses that you have that we have not answered, please hit Matthew with the chat tab, and I'll get cracking on talking about this House relief bill, which is baffling in many respects. Congress generally never misses an opportunity to take advantage of a crisis. And the last time we had a significant crisis, Congress expended its political capital passing Obamacare into law. And in this crisis, the House has worked feverishly to try first to pass a bill that would provide for sweeping federally mandated paid sick leave. And if you receive updates from us, you probably got one in the wee hours Saturday morning, letting you know that legislation had passed the House. That it provided a sweeping new federal mandate for paid sick leave, and it was going to be up to the Senate to see what happens. Well, almost immediately, members of the House put that bill on hold and revised it, and they revised it at least 3 times between its initial passage about midnight Saturday morning until late on Monday afternoon, when they finally sent what they called a technical corrections bill over to the Senate for consideration. Now, the House is in recess until March the 23rd. It's very possible that they could come back, but they are in recess until the 23rd of March. The Senate was in recess over the weekend, and the Senate is back now, and the Senate is considering this particular bill. And, as we look at what's left in the bill, and I say what's left in the bill because a number of the provisions that I think raised eyebrows, at least initially, are no longer there. For starters, paid sick leave as a sweeping permanent federal mandate is out. It's out. It's not in the bill anymore, at least not in its current form. As it stands right now, the bill would add a new category of FMLA leave. And I think what is very confusing about this for so many employers is that it would only apply to employers with fewer than 500 employees. And that's shocking to me, because as it stands right now, employers with fewer than 50 employees have no idea what the FMLA is. Well, I mean, they do, but they have no obligations to comply with it. They have no processes or procedures in place for administering FMLA leave. But yet, as proposed in the bill right now, even small employers, under 50 employees who've never been subject to FMLA before, would be subject to this emergency FMLA leave that the House bill on its way to the Senate has proposed. They initially started out with a bill that said there were going to be multiple classes of FMLA leave arising from various different leaves of absence in connection with a COVID-19 response. They have whittled that down and pared it back significantly. Now there is only one category of proposed FMLA leave that would be in the new bill, again, applicable to all employers with fewer than 500 employees, including governmental employers, including nonprofits. If an employee is unable to work or telework due to a need to leave to care for a son or daughter under 18, where their school or place of child care has closed due to COVID-19, those individuals would be entitled to up to 12 weeks of leave. And you think about those of you who know FMLA, you know that employees don't even get eligible for FMLA until they've worked for 1 year and 1,250 hours. Well, not true under this particular temporary provision. Any employee who worked for you for 30 days prior to the need for leave would be eligible. The first 10 days of leave that an employee takes under this provision are unpaid, although you could offer an employee the opportunity to take their accrued paid leave concurrently with those 10 days if you wanted to. Unlike other FMLA, unlike the regular FMLA, where an employer has the right to require employees to take paid leave concurrently with the first day of FMLA leave, here you can't require it, but you could allow the employee to take some paid leave if they want to for those first 10 days. After 10 days, employees taking FMLA leave, again, for this child care related reason, would get paid leave at a rate of at least 2/3 of their regular rate of pay. However, they slipped in a cap, and I should have highlighted it in red. At the last minute, when this bill went to the Senate, they slipped in a cap to say that the compensation you pay an employee taking this form of leave after 10 days is capped at $200 a day or $10,000 in the aggregate over the course of the 12 weeks. That's a pretty significant reduction in the value of the benefit. I know when we first saw this, we were all thinking, my goodness, 12 weeks, initially it was going to be 14 days, and 12 up to 12 weeks. This is a considerably smaller economic expense. However, I think it's still a terrible burden for small employers who've never had to deal with this before. And I was on the phone with a couple of clients this week who said, Matt, the minute that bill becomes law, if it does, we'll exhaust our equity line in the first payroll. And now I'm going to come back to this. There's another part of the bill, and then there is a tax credit that helps to reimburse employers for these expenses that applies to both aspects of the bill. So I'm going to come back to that. So bear with me. This is the pared down emergency FMLA leave provision. We also have a pared down emergency paid sick leave provision. Same employers covered by it. Employers with fewer than 500 employees, all governmental employers, all nonprofits, all susceptible to this, same as anybody else, including small employers with one employee or more, subject to the emergency paid sick leave provision. Again, it would apply to employees who are unable to work or telework due to a need for leave, but basically due to any COVID-19 related reason. The reasons that delineated here are federal, state, or local quarantine order. In other words, the government has told you you must quarantine, so you're eligible for emergency paid sick leave. A healthcare provider has advised you to self-quarantine, so you would be eligible for the paid sick leave. An employee has symptoms and is seeking a diagnosis. You're going to the doctor based on having identified COVID-19 symptoms to get a diagnosis, and so you've got up to 80 hours paid sick leave, originally 14 days, 80 hours paid sick leave. You're providing care to a family member who's subject to one of those provisions, the government quarantine or a healthcare advisor's recommendation, or that last one there, you're providing care for a child under 18 whose school or child care provider has closed. Now, interestingly, there's a cap on the benefit here too. It's 80 hours of paid sick leave, right, for your full-time employees. Your part-time employees, they get leave equal to their scheduled hours that they would expect to have during a normal 2-week period. The benefit, again, is capped. It's capped. $511 a day, a maximum in the aggregate of $5,110 for the sick reasons to take leave. That's the first, second, or third bullet point. For the fourth or fifth bullet points, the benefit would be capped at $200 a day or $2,000 in the aggregate. Again, it seems like they have made this unduly burdensome to even understand and interpret in an effort to reduce the cost to small business. I'm afraid it has become so difficult to understand that small businesses' heads are going to be spinning. But this is the benefit as proposed in the Senate right now on the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act. And again, let me just say the reason why we're spending time on proposed legislation, we usually don't spend this much time on proposed legislation. This has passed the House with a White House compromise with bipartisan support. And because of the nature of how it was passed, and because of the perception that the Senate now has to do something, we think that factor combined with the urgency with which employers will need to adopt the rules to comply, it necessitates sort of planning now, thinking about it now, understanding it now. Matthew, I'm going to borrow the cursor from you real quick just to move over here to the next slide to talk about the common rules applicable to both of these new forms of leave, both of which have a paid component to them. Again, common rules only applies to employers with fewer than 500. You're going, why in the world did they exempt employers with 500 or more? And the thought was, well, those are employers who are probably already doing something. They've already got the financial resources to do something for these employees. The second piece, there is at least some potential for the Secretary of Labor to step in and issue a regulation that it would jeopardize the viability of small businesses to impose the requirement on employers with fewer than 50 employees. It's very unclear how this provision would work. Early versions of the bill suggested that a small employer would have to submit some sort of petition or affidavit to the Secretary of Labor asking to be excused from compliance if they had 50 or fewer employees. It looks now, based on the current version of the bill, that may have been slipped in there solely to give the Secretary of Labor instant authority upon the passage of the bill to exempt employers of 50 or fewer, or of under 50. It is unclear how that provision would work, but I think small employers have got to stay tuned here and be prepared to act quickly if the bill becomes law with this provision. And I say act quickly because the obligations in the proposed bill would be effective 15 days from the day that the President signs it into law. You know, if we look at how the sausage is made here, remember that if the House bill that's been passed by the House goes over to the Senate and there is any amendment to it in the Senate, anything other than simply passing the bill, it has to then go back to the House for another vote. And we just talked about how the House is in recess until the 23rd. We know that they are trying to work on some remote voting possibilities, but there is expected to be some delay if the Senate does anything to change it. As it stands right now, our lobbyist in Washington has indicated to us that Senator Rand Paul has an amendment that he wishes to propose to the bill and that it was going to be brought to the floor for amendment debate today. That may be going on while we are conducting this webinar. So it's, again, a very fluid situation with the legislation. But assuming best case scenario, this gets signed into law by the President on Friday or Saturday, add 15 days to that, and that's a pretty sudden obligation for an employer to have cash freed up for 14 days of paid sick leave available immediately, and then 2/3 pay up to these caps for individuals who might take FMLA. So, when I heard from some of my small business clients this week, they said, what should we be doing to prepare for this legislation? And I said, other than reaching out to Senator Shelby, Senator Jones's offices, if you're an Alabama employer, I would be in touch with my lender. I would be talking about what we need to do to increase our equity lines, what we need to do to increase our small business loans, to ensure that we have coverage for these expenses in the near term. And they're going, wait a minute, Stiles, you told me there was going to be a tax credit. I'm getting to that. The sunset of these provisions, again, they're both temporary. Nothing here would be permanent. Both temporary provisions. Sunset would be December 31 of 2020. There's expected to be no further obligation after December 31, 2020. So with those common provisions in mind, the legislation does attempt to help employers with the expenses associated with it. But they do so through payroll tax credits, effectively reducing your FICA quarterly payments, your Form 941s that you file on a quarterly basis. You're about to file one, probably already have filled out what you need to file your first quarter Form 941. Assuming this bill takes effect on kind of the schedule we've discussed, that means the first round of paid benefits are going to be made available sometime in April, and you'll be fronting those benefits, and you'd be able to take a tax credit for the full amount of the benefit that you pay against the FICA that you would owe on your Form 941 on June 30th. The current version of the bill says that to the extent that you pay out more in required benefits under this law than you have in FICA credit for the quarter, the surplus of your payment would be treated as an overpayment to the federal government, and the Treasury would owe you a refund. So, again, just kind of working through how this plays out, I think the concern from small businesses, the outlay of the dollars for these benefits are so substantial in the short term, and the ability to recoup the credit is disproportionate to the capital outlay, to the dollars we're spending. And so, ultimately we'd be looking for total reimbursement on a check from the Treasury sometime after we send in our June 30 Form 941. A lot of businesses are going, I don't know if we can weather that amount of time with this kind of cash outlay. So this could be, I think, a real concern for small businesses. And one other aspect to it that I think we get a lot of questions about, and I think I've seen a couple of questions coming in here on the 500 employee threshold. The bill's very unclear exactly how that 500 employee threshold is determined. There is nothing in the legislation that suggests that would be determined on a controlled group basis or an affiliated or jointly owned company basis. All the ways that you've aggregated employee numbers in the past, no indication that you get to aggregate them to get out of the obligation. If anything, the implication of the legislation is that the employee threshold would be determined based on FEIN, Federal Employee ID number, because that's what you'll file your Form 941s under, right? So in order to get the credit, you got to file it under your FEIN. So the implication is that your employee headcount, for purposes of being subject to the legislation, would be determined by FEIN, by Federal Employer ID number. How many employees do you have under your FEIN? Doesn't even get to the question of over what period of time, is that an average? And yet the legislation says the Secretary of Labor would be empowered to issue regulations interpreting the legislation. I don't even know how in the world that regulation would get out soon enough, given the current environment. We've also got a question that says, look, what about all these little nonprofits out here? I mean, this is going to kill us. Although nonprofits generally don't pay tax, they still generally pay OASDI, Social Security tax, on their employees. And so that would be the mechanism by which a nonprofit would be obtaining its credit, is under its OASDI payments to the federal government. So no special provisions for nonprofits in the currently proposed legislation. I note that you've got a slide there. If you are a self-employed employer, there are mechanisms by which you get some relief under the legislation as well. Not to spend much time on that, but there are also provisions in the legislation Matthew touched on by which COVID-19 diagnostics that are approved by the FDA would not be allowed to be subject to copays, deductibles, pre-certs, those kinds of things. Same thing with medical care in connection with an individual participant in your plan going to get a diagnostic test. These rules would be extended not only to group health plans and insurers, but would be passed on to Medicare Advantage plans, Medicaid, CHIP, and TRICARE too. So the intention there is just to make sure that the carriers are doing what they have largely to this point voluntarily offered to do. So in front of you is just sort of a slide that summarizes the current status of the legislation. Of course, that's the status of the legislation as we sat down this morning to be with you at 9:30. And I think we've covered this largely already. But one piece to this that I think is important to keep in mind is that the same day that the House sent this bill over for consideration, and this is a $100 billion bill, relief bill. At that same time, the White House dropped an $850 billion relief bill on the steps of the Senate to start consideration. And we've seen provisions of that legislation which would include immediate cash to families, individual taxpayers. You have to think that if the Senate is looking at ways to best utilize its time, it's going to be spending a lot more of its time on the $850 billion immediate relief bill than it is on this House-passed measure. So I think whether the Senate shifts its priorities to the bigger bill remains to be seen. There's been talk about merging the two pieces of legislation. There's been a substantial outcry from the small business community that the House bill puts them in such a bad spot as to cripple the economy. There's been tremendous outcry from liberal and labor groups to say that exempting employers of 500 or more is unconscionable. So you've got, when you have strange bedfellows both saying that this bill isn't right, it tends to suggest that it could end up in the scrap heap. And so maybe the last 20 minutes that we've spent together ends up being of little value to you. But what we do hope that it helps you do is do some planning, have a pulse on this issue to know that it can have an immediate effect on your business if you fall into one of these categories, and that it's something to stay tuned about. We are in constant contact with your consultants at the Vallent Group. And I'll have to say, I think at least 2/3 of the FAQs that were in the webinar today came to us from your Vallent Group consultants. So we're gathering questions from them to try and address for you here today. So we know that they're monitoring this issue closely, and we're in close contact with them to make sure that our shared resources are beneficial to you. In the meantime, we would ask that if you have questions that we don't get to today, and we're going to hang around for a little bit to try to answer them. If we have questions that we don't get to today, please contact your Vallent Group consultant. They've got tons of answers. They dazzle us with their knowledge every day. We are going to be providing at the end of the day today, hopefully at the latest by the end of the day today, a link to this recording along with a copy of the slides so that you have those at your disposal, and we'll provide those to Vallent Group, which will then be pushing them out to you guys. So to the extent that you would like a copy and you haven't received one by the end of the day today, I would say reach out to your Vallent Group consultant. Again, for my colleague, Matthew Canova, all of us here at Maynard Cooper & Gale, these are trying times. You all are special employers. If there's anything that we can do at any hour to be of help to you, please let us know. I'm sure your friends and colleagues at Vallent Group would say the same. Thank you for joining us today.